The historical dispossession of Native Americans of their lands, their near-genocidal decimation, and the current levels of poverty in which many American Indians live are all ongoing symptoms of what decolonization seeks to remedy. Many video games appear superficially in agreement, but mechanically they often end up supporting the dominant narrative. Games often employ reductive and stereotypical representations of colonialist concepts that provide the player with a familiar, intuitive narrative. This allows the player to focus on gameplay instead, at the cost of perpetuating the colonial rhetoric. Instead of alluding to actual native tribes, for example, many games feature mechanics that mimic warmongering savages with whom coexistence is simply impossible. In this presentation, we want to showcase this phenomenon with a corpus of 3 very distinct games that do, however, align in their portrayal of their respective barbarians. In the open-world role-playing game Fallout 4, the player can expand into the post-apocalyptic wasteland by erecting settlements, which eventually attract pillaging raiders, against whom the settlement must then be defended. In the survival game Conan Exiles, expansion ensures access to the resources necessary to defend against so-called purges, which are assaults from wild tribes drawn to player settlements. Lastly, the turn-based strategy game Civilization V features so-called barbarian encampments that spawn enemies who regularly attack the cities of any nearby civilization. Our analysis will predominantly rely on Bogost's concept of procedural rhetoric to expose how game mechanics make claims about how things work. We will first outline how the games make use of colonialist ideology by denying their respective tribes the right to their land, history, and even humanity, before examining how the player is then mechanically encouraged to expand and establish control over what is perceived as a threatening wilderness.
First and foremost, the outside groups found in our games are presented as inherently unworthy of the land they occupy. This concept is often referred to as Terra Nullius, the land belonging to no one. Rightful ownership is instead tied to labor, such as agriculture. And although its supposed absence in Indian cultures was itself fiction, it was nevertheless historically used to conveniently strip them of any claim to their own land. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, only those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. We see this fiction realized in all our examples. Not only are Fallout 4 settlements defined through their agricultural ambitions, but raising a settlement's food output directly increases its chance of being raided.
The more we establish ourselves here, the more of a target we become.
If you do start up a farm, be ready to deal with the raiders. Why do all the hard work when you can just take what you want at gunpoint?
More importantly, raiders cannot grow crops, but the very same settlements liberated from them can. Raiders inhabit and steal, settlers build and produce. Conan Exiles also features a complex and necessary farming system that is not afforded to the tribes wandering the wasteland. And the more the player builds, the more likely it is for the wild tribes to launch an assault. Likewise, Civilization V's Barbarians aim to lay siege to a player's cities and then pillage its surrounding farms and plantations, while they themselves cannot build anything but military camps. The fact that the land is considered empty is further materialized through the use of marked terrain. While the game's map represents the territory of civilizations with various colors, barbarians merely inhabit the green spaces in between and thus literally cannot lay claim to the land by any means the game deems legitimate. Colonial ideology is therefore naturalized as a literally empty world waiting to be filled by civilizations.
The next step in the colonial legitimation rhetoric, present in 2 of our games, is to deny the natives any claim to cultural heritage and history, while portraying oneself as the true inheritor of the past. Philosophers like Hegel outright claimed that Africa had no history. This is most evident in Civilization V, where settling civilizations are modeled after actual nation-states, whose history and renowned leader they inherit.
England is an ancient land. For many years your people dominated the world stage. Queen Elizabeth, will you bring about a new golden age for the English people?
It was 2016, that referendum. Where's your plan? You said there'll be a big adjustment. Where's your plan? We are facing all sorts of shortages at the moment.
There is no alternative.
Where's the plan?
The plan...
You didn't make a plan, did you?
The Barbarians, by contrast, form a unified, nameless and leaderless tribe. It should also be noted that the progress of in-game history is tied to the player ending their turn, which anchors history to the player and makes it impossible for history to have existed before the arrival of the player. Fallout 4 also openly frames its settlers as the only legitimate inheritors of American history. The settlement system is tied to the faction of the Minutemen, who are the first faction that the player encounters. In referencing their historical namesake, who fought both Indians and the British, Minutemen draw their identity from a distant past, which they, unlike other factions, value and seek to preserve.
Minutemen? So now I'm traveling backward in time.
Protect the people at a minute's notice. That was the idea.
This is evident not only in their name, but also their rhetoric.
This right here must be the Old North Bridge, where the first shots of the American Revolution were fired.
As well as the fact that we first encounter them in a museum. They are also the only faction whose headquarters in the former neighborhood of Sanctuary Hills are situated on top of an actual past settlement. Stripped of their claim to both land and history, what remains is the outsider's humanity. Subsequently, the American Puritan settlers likened the dichotomy of settlers and natives to the fight between God's chosen people and the instruments of Satan, granting the settlers the divine right to exterminate the Indians and take their land. To the Puritans, natives in their role as portents functioned as a divine challenge to their own Christianity. This challenge is gamified in our examples, as the player is factually destined to win by the game's implied creator, or God, but must overcome challenges to prove worthy of victory by repelling and exterminating barbarians, raiders, or purges. The monstrosity ascribed to the natives is particularly mirrored in Fallout 4 and Conan Exiles, where human outsiders are portrayed as functionally identical to other monstrous creatures, such as mutants or demons, who all, just like their human counterparts, relentlessly attack player settlements. This equation is typical for video games, where players have come to regularly take on the avatars of monster hunters.
I'm gonna make video games.
In Conan Exiles, human thralls even share their enslavement mechanics with animals, because humans and animals alike can be caught and used as guards and followers, making them visually disparate, but mechanically the same. The result are clearly human creatures that we do, however, lump together with distinctly non-human animals and monsters. This semantic dilemma, also found in the Puritan portrayals of the Indians as simultaneously human and inhuman, is referred to as the grotesque.
Thanks for your help fighting them off.
What did they want?
They were raiders. What do you think they wanted?
To establish this divine superiority, two of our titles also mark their settlers as distinctly religious. In Conan Exiles, the player must choose a religion for their character upon spawning into the world, and then build shrines that allow her to worship and yield mechanical benefits. This makes divine support dependent on the mechanics of settling. The same can be seen in Civilization V, where only the settlers, through the use of the faith resource, can found pantheons and religions that greatly benefit their citizens. The production of faith is tied to building religious sites and monuments in cities, which is why barbarians, who cannot build cities, do not produce faith and can therefore not be religious. Historically, this rhetoric of the divine versus the satanic is most obvious in the so-called captivity narratives, stories in which mostly female settlers recount their experience of being abducted by Indians and undergoing a dangerous process of conversion. These stories were mostly an attempt to resolve the dilemma of the grotesque by portraying the natives as definitively inhuman through stereotypes of cannibalism and savagery, and have been reimagined in 2 of our titles. In Fallout 4's recurring kidnapping quests, raiders or mutants capture settlers from player-owned settlements, who the player must then free by seeking out the enemy camp and eliminating all captors. A similar mechanic can be observed in Civilization 5, where barbarians capture unprotected settler or worker units and keep them in their camp until it is razed to the ground, which returns the unit back to the player.
As a final expansionist rhetoric, the now dehumanized outgroups are portrayed as inherently aggressive and instinctively drawn to stopping the settlers' progress as a mindless hindrance to the business of empire building. This is most obvious in the genre ascribed to the Civilization series called 4X, which defines the game's dominant goals as explore, expand, exploit, exterminate, therefore centering the colonial notions of displacement, genocide, and erasure. Civilization 5's wilderness is defined as all unclaimed territory. Since the barbarian camps and militia only spawn on unoccupied terrain, the player is therefore encouraged to ensure that all terrain is occupied. This is further motivated through the necessity to have so-called luxury goods on one's own territory in order to raise the civilization's happiness rating, which ultimately boosts progress immensely. Expansion is achieved through sending out settlers to found new cities and through producing the resource of culture, which automatically expands a city's territory over time, echoing Stuart Hall. Whites develop culture to subdue and overcome nature. This means that the game legitimizes expansion through what it perceives as culture, which barbarians who do not own territory must therefore lack. This fits Naya's definition of the term barbarians as people without culture. Conan Exiles' wilderness is also filled with respawning enemies that make traversal unsafe. It is therefore necessary to establish outposts that facilitate further exploration. The game also promotes expansionism by merging it with the colonial rhetoric of legitimizing slavery. The game's so-called thrall system marks all hostile humans found out in the wild as experts in different professions, such as blacksmiths or armorers. Instead of eliminating them, they can be knocked unconscious, captured and enslaved to boost the speed of crafting stations or defend settlements as guards. So. Wir beklappen sie. Enslaving these other survivors, who are presented as warmongering savages found in the wilderness, therefore constitutes an essential part of Conan Exiles' rhetoric of how a settler community must operate, in line with the colonial discourse that used primitivism to justify forced labor. Lastly, Fallout 4's post-apocalyptic world superficially inverts these spaces of nature and civilization by turning robots and cars into enemies and hazards, and having groups of raiders inhabit spaces of former civilization, such as hotels, factories, and malls. Mechanically, however, the concept of the dangerous frontier remains. We are still encouraged to put on our metaphorical cowboy hat, just like the character Preston Garvey did in the literal sense, to push back against the now urban wilderness, reclaim ground and spread a network of newly constructed settlements connected via caravans to make the Commonwealth safe again. Settlements can only be built in predetermined areas, but greatly enhance the player's ability to store, upgrade, and restock during expeditions. The Minutemen also allow the player to call for backup through the use of a flare, which only works when a settlement is nearby. This further incentivizes expansion to make combat safer. Since Preston Garvey constantly sends the player off to liberate yet another settlement, the player eventually establishes control over the entire Boston area.
One day, we'll be strong enough to drive that scum out of the Commonwealth for good. As usual, I've got something else for you to look into.
Another settlement needs our help. I'll mark it on your map.
Our analysis shows clear parallels between the procedural rhetoric found in our games and the actual colonial rhetoric used to legitimize expansionism and genocide. They rob the outside group of any claims to their land and culture and equate them to animals, while the player is granted divine rights to expand, exterminate, and even enslave. Further research could examine how this is offset in future iterations of these franchises, as for example in the Barbarian Clans game mode added to Civilization VI, which offers diplomatic relations with barbarians and allows them to become peaceful city-states of their own.
Thank you so much for watching. The original draft of this presentation was recorded for the 2022 annual conference of the Canadian Game Studies Association, which explains the more formal tone. If you know of other examples that fit what we described, let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and consider subscribing for more videos on game studies. Stay safe out there.